year was 1867. The place was the dry, dusty interior of what we call South Africa today, along the middle reaches of the Orange River. This was the Platland, in Afrikaans, the flatland. This was southern Africa's outback. And indeed, this was an open frontier zone, to use the concept we introduced in the last lecture. One day in 1867, a couple of children of a farm worker family on an Afrikaner held a farm in this area, found a small rock, a pebble. They played games with it. Kids all over the world, of course, play games with stones and pebbles and marbles and what have you. It looked different to them. It looked different to their parents. The owner of the farm, Skok van Niekerk, wound up giving it rather casually to a guy named John O'Reilly, who was a transport rider, as they called him, that is, a handler of teams of draft oxen and horses, an itinerant hawker in this part of the southern African interior. O'Reilly took it to Hopetown, which is the nearest crossroads, sleepy village. The local merchants assured him that the rock was worthless. Not to be deterred, O'Reilly took it on to Colesburg, a little bit bigger place, where the local magistrate found that the edge of this pebble would cut glass quite easily. Eventually, the stone is sent in an unsealed envelope a couple of 100 miles further south to the eastern Cape colony town of Grahamstown, where a legitimate jeweler, in fact, pronounced it to be a diamond. In fact, a rather handsome one of something over 21 carats. Eventually, the diamond would make its way to Cape Town, where Richard Southey, the colonial secretary of the Cape Colony, at one point announced, rather pompously perhaps, that this diamond is the rock upon which the future success of South Africa will be built. Pompous maybe, but also accurate. If that rock, however, was to be important, what about a different kind of rock? In this case, gold. Less than 20 years later, in 1886, enormous deposits of gold, begin to be discovered in the area now surrounding the modern city of Johannesburg. The dramatic discoveries of diamonds and gold, the world's largest deposits of each, set in motion a mineral revolution which constitutes, in my mind, the last great piece of the puzzle leading us to 20th century South Africa. The mineral revolution eventually impacted virtually every household in the whole southern African region in the past century. Well, let's turn back to diamonds and what ensues following the discoveries in 1867. The key to understanding the significance of Kimberley, and Kimberley is the city which emerged overnight in the middle of these discoveries. It did not exist before, any more than Johannesburg existed before gold was discovered there. The key to understanding Kimberley's significance is to see the transformation of a diamond rush into something very different, a modern, deep-level mining industry. Let's take that term rush for a minute. In a classic mineral rush, and we think of the gold rush in 1849 in California, or the gold rushes in the Klondike and the Yukon in 1898 and so forth. If we have imagery of that, it goes something like this. The word spreads fast. Lots of people, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly males, pour into the area where the finds have been made. There's lots of furious searching and clawing and panning and digging for these hoped-for riches during the day. At night, there's generally lots of drinking and fighting. A few people strike it rich, most don't. Everybody leaves, and a ghost town is left behind. Now, most of that stuff did occur at Kimberley, except the last part, the exodus and the left behind ghost town. And again, the key to that is the transformation of this into a modern deep-level mining industry. Now, to take the rush phase, thousands of so-called diggers, and that was the term they were known by, came to the region from all over the world, and I mean all over the world. They came from America, they came from Latin America, from every corner of Europe, from Australia, and from every part of Southern Africa. And a substantial number of them, for a while, were black Southern Africans. Now, the diggers were assigned and worked separate small claims, and I do mean small. Some of them were as small as 10 square yards. That's approximately 2 yards by 5 yards, 6 feet by 15 feet. In a particular diamondiferous area around Kimberley, that is, places where the diamonds were being found, we would find hundreds, at the largest of them, 1,600 different claims laid out on a space of a number of acres. Now, holding a claim in theory gave you the right to dig directly perpendicular into the Earth's surface. You can perhaps see that this is going to lead to problems. The deeper they went, the greater were the difficulties and the dangers that they met. After all, if I am, as my students say, the slacker, and next door to me you are working very hard and excavating more dirt than me, you are going to carry your claim further into the earth than I am. This creates, of course, a wall of dirt on the side of your claim, which at any moment could collapse. It not only might bury the hardworking digger next door, or at least injure him, it raises a kind of interesting legal question about whose diamonds those are that are found in the rubble of the cave-in or the collapse. Just getting the dirt out of here becomes a project, and it's just jerry-rigged for a long time. Along the edges, they create small towers with ropes or guy wires leading to the particular digger's claim, and a set of pulleys is used to take bucket by bucket the excavated dirt out to the edges of this claim. The great South African historian C.W. de Kivi described this as an insane asylum unleashed upon a beach. That's the way it looked, this furious activity. The beach is a reference to how dry and sandy the soil is. If you go deep enough, of course, you hit the water table and the problems of flooding begin to be a factor. Now, meanwhile, though, as more and more diamonds are being discovered, just as the costs and dangers are going up, the price of them is falling as more are coming onto the market. Now, you know, supply and demand scarcity is a factor in the pricing of almost anything. But here it's worth making a particular point. Scarcity might be especially important in a case like these particular mineral products. You know, diamonds and gold are different kettle of fish than things like iron or copper or petroleum. With all of those things, you get energy or you get materials that are useful in carrying out actual tasks. They are productive minerals in the most direct sense. Diamonds and gold is a different story. The value of diamonds and gold for centuries, I guess millennia, has rested largely on a psychological appreciation here. And that means that the question of scarcity becomes even more important. It was none other than Adam Smith, one of the great economists of all time, who carried out an analysis that he called the water-diamond paradox. I remember encountering this in Econ 101 at some point. He was trying to explain scarcity and pricing, and he said, look at water. It's the most important thing on earth, the most valuable thing on earth. Everybody needs it. Every plant needs animals. Every human needs it to survive. And yet, it's relatively inexpensive because relatively plentiful. Diamonds, on the other hand, you can't do much of anything with, but relatively expensive because relatively scarce. So the solution, if a viable diamond industry was to survive, was to control the output of diamonds onto the market, to control the scarcity factor, and to attract the huge capital investment necessary to finance up-to-date mining technology and a large mine labor force. Diamonds were still there. As you go deeper, you encounter the so-called blue earth in the Kimberley region. There's plenty of diamonds there, but getting at them at deeper and deeper levels spelled the end of the digger with his pick, his shovel, and his bucket. Well, at this point, we need to introduce an economic genius, and I think he deserves that label, and of course, he's a towering figure in Southern African history. His name, of course, is Cecil John Rhodes. Many of you may know him as the one who endowed the Rhodes Scholarships at his old alma mater, where he was a generally mediocre student, and that was, of course, Oxford. Born in England of a Anglican priest, he went out to southern Africa as a very young man to join his brother, who was already living the life of adventure there. It shouldn't surprise us. He soon made his way to where the action was centered and concentrated at Kimberley. And there is where he first worked, in some ways, his magic. Rhodes was able to forge through his own charisma and charm, through his own ability to turn the deal, through what many thought was indeed his wheeling and dealing, or in some cases backstabbing. He was able to forge a marketing mechanism for the diamond industry that is still with us today. It's a word that all of you have heard. It's De Beers. De Beers Consolidated, De Beers Mining Corporation, etc. De Beers was Rhodes's creation and designed specifically to control the feeding of markets onto the world economy, so that the scarcity was controlled and the price could be maintained. I don't know of any other commodity or any other firm, I suppose, that has gotten as close to a long-lasting monopoly. In a sense, De Beers puts Rockefeller and Standard Oil or Gates and Microsoft in the shade when it comes to creating something like a workable monopoly. I had reason to be in a jewelry shop a few months ago, and the local jeweler said that despite such things as so-called dirty diamonds, the smuggling of diamonds onto the world market, that we'll revisit it in a later lecture, that De Beers remains the central power in the entire industry, even today. Rhodes was also the guy behind attracting and organizing this enormous infusion of capital from the great banking houses of Europe, the Rothschilds and so on, so that the beginning of the excavation and creation of these huge or very deep vertical shafts into the earth, the horizontal shafts that would go to the rock face where the actual mining would be controlled. All of this required new kinds of technology, new sources of energy, the application of steam energy, electric energy, eventually petroleum, and so forth. For its time, it was state-of-the-art of the Industrial Revolution. So, like Shaka, whom we met a few lectures back, Rhodes had an enormous impact on Southern African history despite living a comparatively short life. Shaka lived 41, 42 years. Rhodes, born in 1853, dies in 1902 at 49. His ambitions and his achievements certainly went far beyond the business world. He became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in 1890, held that post for 6 years, and as we'll see in a lecture fairly soon, he is the key factor in extending the British Empire northward from South Africa into the two territories that were named for him, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. I don't know of any other figure myself in history with not one but two countries named after him. Now, Kimberley became the, again to quote C.W. de Kieviet, a book written in 1941, A History of South Africa, Social and Economic. The language is old-fashioned, but in some ways nobody ever nailed the mineral revolution better than de Kieviet. He called Kimberley the, quote, the cradle and testing ground for certain practices, certain institutions with a lasting visibility in Southern Africa. I would highlight above all, I think, Kimberley as the original home of the so-called closed compound. Now, if you think of a compound as a physical structure, you may see, for instance, enclosure, first of all. You see fencing or walling around a space, inside that space. In other words, access and egress very closely controlled there. Inside there, you're likely to see in a compound largish buildings of hostel or barracks style, designed to house a large number of people in relatively rudimentary sorts of style. Now, how and why does the compound emerge here? Again, we go back to the peculiar nature of diamonds. Diamonds pack an enormous amount of value, but diamonds pack that value into a very, very small package. For that reason, diamonds have always been a target for what mine owners considered theft. Diamonds have always been objects of smuggling and contraband and so forth, and they are today. So one problem which Rhodes and his fellow diamond magnates refer to as IDB, illicit diamond buying, or illegal diamond buying, if you like. In other words, they're evading the flow controlled by De Beers, and this begins with theft by miners, okay? The miner who puts in the 8-hour shift or the 10-hour shift might indeed be tempted to take the 10th after giving the mining company the first 9 or putting that into the hopper. Finding that 10th one at the end of the day might indeed be tempted, I think I would be, to slip it into a pocket, maybe put it under the tongue, tuck it in your ear, indeed, swallow it. This is the hardest thing on earth. There's nothing in your intestines that's going to dissolve a diamond. So indeed, this is one way to smuggle diamonds out of the mines. So controlling IDB, Rhodes and others pioneered the erection and creation of these closed compounds. By housing and feeding the mine workers in an enclosed space with restricted access and egress, the miners could, at the close of each shift, not only could they be marched there to start the shift, at the close of a shift, the first place they could go were into the so-called holding rooms, where they could be searched, and I do mean given full body searches, in order, again, to get a handle and a control on this problem of so-called IDB. Now, Rhodes had no illusions that this temptation affected only black African miners. If he'd had his way, he would have had, I'm sure it would have been more comfortable, but he would have subjected white miners. Already we're seeing a kind of precipitation of this labor force into a group of white miners doing the shift boss work, the skilled and semi-skilled work, and a huge number of low-skilled or semi-skilled African workers beneath them in the authority structure. White miners, to put it bluntly, had the social and political clout to resist this kind of control. So the closed compound comes to be an institution associated with the black workforce, on the mines first at Kimberley. But although they're originally constructed to control theft, I put it this way, IDB is a good place to start in understanding why compounds became so important, but it's not a good place to stop. The compounds provided a number of other advantages if this was going to be a viable industry. They were useful in imposing sort of overnight what we might call modern labor discipline. This is an industry where everybody has to be in their place at a particular time. And the notion of being able to wake the miners en masse, feed them en masse, get them there at the right time to do the shift work and so forth, a tremendous advantage. The sheer effort of control. You could keep troublemakers out of the compound, or union organizers, or what have you. And finally, simply the economies of scale. You could control costs by feeding people, buying in economic lots of large scale, by housing people en masse here. Now, the dichotomy here, this geographical, this spatial dichotomy between the mine, the point of production, over here, but over here, the workforce. This dichotomy, the residential area assigned to the black workforce, eventually you see this mirrored, you see it reflected in almost every city and town, large and small, in South Africa today. You have the town center, the point of production, and then over there, maybe across that open space, you find the township. Very specific meaning in Southern Africa. It's not just urban area. Town here, the township, the location, in Afrikaans, the lokasie. That's where the black urban workforce is housed. Again, this has left a mark still visible today, even though the legal structures behind this have been erased after 1990. Now, the diamond industry alone would have had a substantial impact on Southern African history, no question about it. Take that impact and multiply it by a factor of about 10. And you have some idea of what the gold mining industry has meant. I think it can honestly and rightly be said that gold, in many respects, built modern South Africa. Gold was the basis for the development of the gigantic Witwatersrand, Johannesburg urban complex. This is the largest urban complex in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Gold underlay the enormous investment in infrastructure and eventually in secondary industry, which became typical of these urban areas here. In a sense, South Africa is starting down the road to what it still is in a lot of respects, and that is a first world country combined with a third world country rolled into one. The urban and industrial sector becomes the country's driving force. But again, the peculiarity of the particular minerals we're talking about here, the deposits found around the Witwatersrand area, around Johannesburg, were the largest that had ever been found in total quantity. But in terms of ore quality, it was a very different story. These were very poor in ore quality. In other words, it was an enormous amount of gold-bearing ore which produced a relatively small amount of actual gold. And it was embedded, it had to be extracted, and so forth. In general, you had to take out something like 3 tons of rocks and dirt in order to come up with and extract a single ounce of gold. Now, what does this have to do with what I turn to now, and that is the development of migrant labor? You could put it this way. Without a huge, low-wage African workforce, South Africa's gold might have been left in the ground. The cost of getting it out with its low ore quality might have meant that these huge deposits might never have been exploited. Instead, as I said, they made modern South Africa. Eventually, then, the mineral revolution's impact on people, on ordinary people, throughout southern Africa was felt most directly in the creation of a low-wage, oscillating, that simply means back and forth, that is from the rural village to the mine or the city, increasingly, and back, okay? A low-wage, oscillating migrant labor system. This is the way, the creation of this migrant labor system is the way the effects of the mineral discoveries is transmitted to ordinary people, ordinary households, right through the entire subcontinent of southern Africa. For my money, labor migrancy, you can certainly make an argument, is the single greatest reality in most people's lives over the last century or so, right through that region. But why did people go? It's not as simple a question as people often assume. First of all, mining is hot, dirty, dusty, dangerous work. 58,000 deaths in the last 100 years from accidents underground in South Africa's gold mine. That doesn't include people who lost hands or fingers or people who developed lung diseases, etc., etc. Especially at low wage levels, why would anybody do it? Why would they migrate from a rural community to work in these mines, and increasingly in the secondary industry? So eventually the question morphs into one of why do people go from the rural countryside to the mines and the cities of southern Africa? And again, it's more complex. There's a whole variety of reasons for this. The same migrant might go for different reasons for one journey as opposed to the next. There's combinations of factors at work here. There was a measure of direct compulsion early on, yes. People who would go into rural communities, put a gun to people's heads, round them up, literally bind them and take them to mine. Did this happen? Yes, it did happen. It was a kind of temporary slavery. But it tended to happen only early on. It was illegal, for one reason. But after a while, as the mineral revolution takes hold and this becomes a system with a momentum of its own, frankly, direct compulsion of the sort I just described is unnecessary. There are other factors, both push factors, compelling people, and pull factors, attracting people, which create a dynamic of, in fact, usually a surplus of available labor without the need for these kinds of crude compulsion that I mentioned. Some migrants went quite voluntarily indeed to obtain the money for consumer goods. Cultural tastes, after all, are changing in this period. People want Western-style clothes, or they want that factory-made wool or cotton blanket for their dear old dad, or the three-legged iron pot that you see in so many places for their dear old mother or grandmother. They might want to work for a while, come back home, and invest in the rural sector. Purchase cattle as draft oxen. Buy the iron plows that allow you to perhaps be more prosperous without having to go to the mine next time. You might want to invest in your children's education and therefore make it possible for them to avoid going down in the mine, such as you had to do. And finally, there's no need to deny the reality of cultural factors here. You know, the attraction of the bright lights all over the world. Rural peoples or peoples from small communities have wanted to go to where the action is. And indeed, in cultural terms, the big city, these townships become the place where a vibrant urban culture, which is still seen today in music and drama and poetry and literature and so forth, this is where it's born, and a lot of people want to be a part of it. Now, to continue our understanding of why people migrated in such numbers, remember that the mineral revolution was unfolding in these decades of the 1870s, 80s, 90s, into the first decades of the 20th century, exactly during the same decades as the overall military and political conquest of Africa is taking place. And that, of course, we're going to turn to with a wider lens in some following lectures. All of the new regimes, of course, were states, and states tax. They imposed taxes on the population, and they had to be paid in colonial currencies. Now, for a time, it was possible for some people, a substantial number of people, to earn the money they needed to pay the tax, or the money they wanted or felt they needed for some of these new goods or to invest at home and so forth, by selling produce from their rural farms. After all, urban populations have to be fed. And some people are able to actually get the resources they need by selling products off of home. You might consider this the cash crop option, a way to avoid going to the city. But of course, if you're going to follow the cash crop option, you have to have land on which to grow the crops. If land has been lost, as it was in enormous quantities, precisely to settler occupation, then the land is not available, and therefore the cash crop option is not available. Some people live too far from the infrastructure. It was simply too costly to get products to market, which again might have allowed them to pursue the cash crop option and to avoid the option of going to the mines and the cities. Over time, then, migration tended to become unavoidable rather than discretionary. Again, this doesn't happen overnight, but by the 1920s or 30s, this mineral revolution has taken hold. And as I say, at that point, it is no longer a discretionary migration in many respects. It's become a reality for household after household after household, that someone, in order to in the most basic sense, make ends meet and to survive, is going to have to be part of this migrant labor equation. Virtually every household, as I say, is touched by it. The development of the city then, and the development of Southern Africa, South Africa's enormous wealth at one level and at the urban locus, is mirrored by the underdevelopment of the countryside, as able-bodied labor, particularly male labor, in its most productive years, is absent. Now, what does this mean for women? Increasing numbers of women did make it to the city, and they filled various niches ranging from beer production to domestic service to small-scale retail commerce, et cetera, et cetera. But for several generations, most migrants were male, who returned periodically to their families in the rural areas. What their absence meant was that the burden of maintaining rural households, where, after all, the next generation of migrants is growing up, is borne increasingly by women alone. It's not like they didn't have a great deal to do before, but now they often have to perform those tasks, the early season plowing, for instance, the clearing for fields formerly performed by males. In a very real sense. I don't think this is overstating the case. Rural African women, even millions of them who never saw the city, who never made the journey, who never went to the urban areas, played a crucial role in making the growth of Southern Africa's urban economy viable. Thank you.